welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you, and He doesn't just love you a little. He loves you so much that before He laid the foundations of the universe, before He laid the foundations of the earth, He was willing to commit to going through all of this pain and suffering and misery and everything that we look around us and go, how can God tolerate all of these things? And God would look at you and say, I'm willing to suffer through all of these things with you. I'm willing to go to the cross to pay everything for the opportunity to spend eternity with you. That is an amazing concept, and I hope it's one that you'll grasp someday. Now, this week we're going to talk about infinity. Before we jump into and finalize this question of could the universe have existed past eternal, well, that idea of past eternal, we really need to address this issue of infinity. And what does infinity actually mean outside of a term that we throw around in popular movies here recently? Infinity, when we really think about it, and I want to be very careful how I state this, infinity is something that really only exists in a mathematical sense. And no question, in a mathematical sense, infinity is an entirely valid concept. But there's a difference between something that exists mathematically in a mathematical formula or in a mathematical sense and something that exists in the real world. Let me give you an example. One of the areas that I didn't go into when we were addressing Stephen Hawking's work an episode or so ago was Hawking's earlier work in his first book, A Brief History of Time. Hawking was attempting to wipe out the singularity that existed at the beginning of the universe. And the way he was able to accomplish it, was using a mathematical, I don't want to use the word trick because there's nothing inappropriate about it. When you say trick, it makes it sound like somebody did something unseemly. There's nothing inappropriate about it. He used a mathematical maneuver to inject imaginary time into Einstein's equations. Now, the introduction of imaginary time is a difficult concept for us to grasp because, of course, it doesn't really exist. Imaginary time would only exist in an imaginary universe. But when he interjected imaginary time into the equation, what he was able to do was to wipe out the idea of the singularity. He was able to kind of smooth it over. The problem is it's just a mathematical exercise. In the real world, the exercise is meaningless. In an imaginary world, I guess it has meaning, but we don't live in an imaginary world. So in an imaginary sense, he was able to do that. But again, it only existed mathematically. It didn't exist in the real world. We're going to run into that same issue with the idea of infinity. And the idea is going to be problematic going backwards rather than going forwards. And let me give you part of an explanation of why that is, because this gets really difficult to grasp. If we start off with a beginning point of day zero, well, that's not really infinity because you have a starting point that you can clearly identify. And you continue adding one day on every day going forward, even if you do so for forever, it's not infinite because you're ultimately going to be, even though you continue adding numbers on, it's potentially infinite, but never actually reaches infinity because you always have a starting point that you can count back to. Even if the number gets really big, it will always be a real number. It will never be infinity. If you try to assume that going backward in the past, and we say an actual infinite set of numbers exists, when we try to apply that to the real world, that's where we start running into absurdities. We start running into things that don't make any sense. It feels like the right way to say it is it starts creating logical absurdities. And I want to be clear about this because people will say infinities actually exist, and they do within within numerical sets. But when you try to bring them over into the real world, that's where you start running into ludicrous examples of things that just don't make any sense. And I think we need to understand that before we address this idea of could the universe have been past eternal? So let's talk about that for a minute. How do we understand that real infinities cannot exist? Let's say, for example, that we look at a collection of numbers and we have a real infinite collection of numbers. So we have infinity. But let's say we decided that we were going to get rid of 99% of infinity. We got rid of it, we got rid of 99% of infinity, and we had 1% left. How much do we actually have left? The answer is infinity. Even though we got rid of 99% of infinity, if we're left with 1% of infinity, we still have infinity. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We got rid of 99% of it. But it becomes ridiculous to try to quantify it because, again, when you're dealing with an actual infinity in the real world, it doesn't make any logical sense. Yeah, I got rid of 99% of it, but I'm still left with everything. We can't be left with everything. You got rid of 99% of it. There's just numerous examples you can give as you look at this. So when you're dealing with numbers, an actual infinite in the real world is something that is not going to be possible. You can have a potential infinite, but an actual infinite is not going to work. This becomes very problematic looking back into the past, because in the past we would be dealing with an actual infinite. If the universe existed past eternal, in other words, the universe has always existed, and there is no starting point, then you're going to start to run into these numerical absurdities when you try to wrap your arms around the idea of an actual infinite when you look backward in time. The philosophy behind it gets really dicey as we actually try to deal with a past infinite set of numbers. But if you're dealing with a past infinite, realistically speaking, from a philosophical perspective, you could never actually reach today going forward because you'd forever be trying to get to today. And again, I understand it is a difficult philosophical concept to grasp. I think it's suffice to say that an actual set of infinite numbers in reality is something that is just logically absurd. It doesn't make sense and it cannot make sense. So why are we dealing with this week? Why are we looking at this question of infinity? What you're going to find is two instances where people try to push the idea of an actual infinite. The first is what we're talking about right now. Could the universe have existed past eternal? The reason that that is important is because once you're forced to deal with a starting point, then the game is up. You have to explain the starting point. You have to deal with what's going on. And again, that ultimately brings you down to a question of a creation event of the universe and an explanation for what caused it. Once you have to deal with that, your options start slimming down very quickly. We've been talking about the other two options. Either we were created by an outside third party, or the universe simply created itself, which is not a terribly appealing option to argue philosophically, logically, or scientifically. People do it, but again, there's a lot of problems going there. The second time we're going to see this argued for is going to be coming up in our next set of videos when we look at this question of the fine-tuning of the universe. You see, in either one of these cases, if you're dealing with a gargantuanly big number, let's say the universe is, instead of, some scientists, many scientists think the universe is 14 billion years old. Even if you pushed it way further back, the problem is, anytime you're dealing with a starting point, you're going to need an explanation. And from a naturalistic standpoint, you've got to avoid that at all costs, because the questions are too many and the answers are very problematic. So when we look at this week's question, short video this week again, but I want to consider this idea of infinity. Is an actual infinite possible? The answer is no, because it doesn't make logical sense. Now, a potential infinite going forward, can you keep adding one number? Yeah, sure, you can keep adding one number. Again, into perpetuity, you can do that. But there'll always be a starting point. There'll always be a starting point when you begin counting and bringing it forward. And the number may get enormously big, but we all understand the starting point. That's a potential infinite. It never really reaches infinity. It could potentially, but again, it doesn't, because you have a starting point that we've all agreed on, and we all understand that starting point. But that's what we're trying to avoid here. Well, that's what some are trying to avoid here. So, on this question that we're going to address here coming up very shortly, can the universe be past eternal? It's important that we understand that real infinites, that an actual infinite in the past is not possible. You can't have infinity going backwards in time because it brings about all sorts of logical impossibilities. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting that like and subscribe button. As always, you can find us here on our YouTube channel or over on iTunes and Spotify. You can find us on our website at prooftograce.com, or you can find us out online via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode where we address the question, can the universe be past eternal? Thank you so much. Bye-bye.